Tet McMillan, a wide receiver out of Arizona, could be the choice for the Jets when they pick 7th overall in the NFL draft. He may not be the dominant contested catch receiver his 6'5" frame would suggest, but he might be just what the Jets need as a number 2 receiver behind Garrett Wilson. Let's break it down today on Locked On Jets.
You are Locked On Jets, your daily New York Jets podcast. Part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome. This is the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. It's Monday, April 14th, 2025, and I'm your host, John B. from GangGreenNation.com. Thank you so much for making the show your first listen or first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday, and today's episode is brought to you by Nissan, the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Stay tuned for the Armada Player of the Week later in the show. Well, the NFL draft is fast approaching, so it's time to break down some of the prospects the Jets could select 7th overall in depth. And today we're going to focus on Tet McMillan, a wide receiver out of Arizona, the consensus top wide receiver prospect in this year's NFL draft. We're going to talk about where he could fit in for the Jets, what role he could have on this team if the Jets select him 7th overall. We'll talk about some of his weaknesses, some of the things he needs to work on, but we'll start off by talking about what he brings to the table. And when I break down NFL draft prospects, I try and avoid saying that, either a guy is good or he's bad. And sometimes I'm not great at following this advice, but I think it's really important to keep an open mind with NFL draft prospects because there are lots of prospects who have certain skills and they lack other skills and they have to work on the things that they lack. And if they go to the right team, a team that understands how to use their skills correctly, they could thrive. If they go to the wrong team, a team that doesn't understand how to use their skills, they could struggle. So the first thing I always try and do when I focus on a prospect is figure out what can he do, what does he struggle with that he needs to work on, and where does he fit on a team. Now, Tet McMillan is a big receiver. He's 6'5", he's 219 pounds, a guy who's a really big receiver. But I think his skill set's a little bit different than the stereotype you would have for a receiver of his size. So, what sticks out about him? Well, the first is we'll start off with I think he's a good hands catcher. And that's important. It's important to catch the ball with your hands, and I think he's got pretty good hands. It's important to not let the ball hit you in the chest when you catch it for a couple of reasons. First of all, that tends to lead to drops. Second of all, you want to be aggressive. You want to use your hands. You want to reach out. You want to pluck the ball out of the air. First of all, it makes it tougher for defenders to knock it down. If you're waiting for the ball to hit you in the chest, it gives defenders extra time to react and knock the ball down. Also, catching with your hands gives you the opportunity to get on the run quickly. If you watch McMillan, one of the things that he does, he catches the ball and then he's ready to move up the field. And sometimes the defender's bearing down on him, ready to make the tackle after the catch, but he's already gone because he's caught the ball with his hands and he's kicked it into the next gear. So that's a really important thing for a wide receiver. I mean, after all, at the wide receiver position, your job is first and foremost to catch the football. And he does that with he has good fundamentals. He's a good hands catcher. And that's, maybe it sounds silly, but I think that's really important. I prefer to have a guy who attacks the football with his hands than anything else. And that's something that will lead to success in the NFL. Another thing that I'll say is that when he has the ball in his hands, he's actually a pretty good playmaker. A lot of bigger receivers are slower. They aren't really that dynamic after the catch. I mean, think about a guy the Jets just decided to keep at the end of last week, Allen Lazard. Nobody's ever going to accuse Allen Lazard, even though he's a bigger receiver, of being tough to bring down in the open field. But Tet McMillan is, and in different ways than you might expect a receiver of his size. I mean, I think a lot of like bigger receivers, you think of guys who are just going to lower their shoulder, run with power. A guy who comes to mind for me who fit that description, who played in the NFL many years ago, was Anquan Boldin, who kind of played the wide receiver position like a running back. I think, Jets example might be a guy who really didn't have that many good years, but when he was playing well, Quincy Enunwa was a good example of that guy who was just really tough to bring down. McMillan, I don't know that calling him a finesse player after the catch would be a good description, but you think of a big guy, they usually struggle with like lateral agility because it's tough to move side to side when you have like big legs and it's tough to be explosive. But McMillan can throw moves on guys. I think he has a good jump cut in the open field where he can jump left and a guy can dive and miss him as a tackler. I also think that once McMillan kicks it into high gear, some guys who are tall, they have longer legs, so they're long striders. So it takes them time to build up. But once they build up, they have an extra gear. And I think that's something that describes McMillan. He's a guy who can be very dynamic after the catch. And when you combine that with hands catching, you hit him on the run, he's going to have catch the ball with his hands. He's going to be ready to go. He's catch it. Boom. I'm going up the field. That can be a very dynamic combination for a wide receiver prospect. So McMillan can be a possession receiver. He's the type of guy who can really help a quarterback out in the short game. I think that there are elements of his game that will help him on deep routes. I think there are some areas as a deep route runner where he struggles, and we'll get to them a little bit later. But I think that he does a good job on north and south routes of setting up defensive backs. I think he does a good job running his route really hard at them. You go straight down the field and make it look like you're going long and then hitting the brakes and coming back. He does a good job sinking his hips and getting back to the football. Again, that's important. And one thing he's good at coming back to the ball. He is good at when the route calls for him to hit the brakes and come back. He's good at doing that. And I think that he's going to be a guy who can be very helpful to whatever team drafts him on like back shoulder type throws, situations where he's got to look back to the football and where he's got to come back a little bit. And I think he'll also help a team in situations that are kind of like scramble drills. And that's when the quarterback gets outside the pocket. Because one thing I noticed, when he was playing at Arizona, on situations where the play kind of left the structure, where, the route, for whatever reason, the quarterback did not read the progression, or, there was pressure and the quarterback had to bail on the pocket. McMillan was good at looking back. And he was good at kind of finding the soft spot in the defense. Now, I'm not sure they did a great job getting him the ball in those situations. I think that the quarterback he played with in college was kind of inconsistent. He was a guy who was, kind of up and down, a guy who left some throws on the field. But I try and separate the stuff that McMillan could control with the stuff he can't. And I think one of the things he could control was he was good at looking back and seeing when the play broke down. And sometimes, when that situation presents itself, you got to break your route off. You got to go somewhere else. You got to find the soft spot in the defense, or you got to come back to the quarterback and make a big target. And of course, at 6'5", Tet McMillan is a very, very big target. So I think that that's another thing that could be a real advantage for him. And this is, these are the types of things that make me feel like he could succeed as a pro, because, what are some of the things I talked about? He can be helpful in the short game. He can be helpful in the long game, and he can also, he can help you when plays break down. He can work the intermediate route. And I think it's really important as a wide receiver prospect to be able to get to all three levels on the field. The short game, under 10 yards, the intermediate game between 10 and 20, and then the long game, 20 yards down the field. We know that the Jets don't really have a great deep threat. And I think we'll get to this in a bit. I think there are going to be some areas where Tet McMillan is not a great deep receiver, at least as he begins in the NFL. But I do think he'll be good on the situations where he's got, the intermediate and longer comeback route, where he's running, he's fired out of a cannon. He's running his route really hard down the field. Defender is giving him cushion. Defender backs off because he doesn't want to get beat over the top. And then McMillan can just hit the stop button and come back to the ball. I think that's the type of thing that will help. And look, I think that, in today's NFL, you got to have receivers who can make plays after the catch. The NFL is a league where the short passing game is paramount, where you're looking for a lot of high percentage completions, and there's a lot on the plate of your receiver to make plays after the catch. He's a good runner after the catch, and not in ways you would imagine a 6'5" receiver to be, because again, like bigger receivers, you think that they're going to be power guys, whereas McMillan's a guy who can, throw a move on you. He can force a tackler to whiff, and then he can find the opening. I think he's also good at reading defenders, reading his blocks down the field, and can create plays that way. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we'll talk about the things Tet McMillan needs to work on. Now, as with any prospect, these aren't deal breakers. These are things that he could improve on, but these are the things that, could give you pause about what he can contribute as he enters the league. And we'll get to them as we continue here on this Monday edition of the Locked On Jets podcast. Today's episode of Locked On Jets is brought to you by the Amazon Fire TV Stick 4K. Did you know your Fire TV is also an Xbox? Turn any TV into your gaming and entertainment hub with the Fire TV Stick 4K devices. No console required. Just grab your pair controller, subscribe or sign into the Xbox Game Pass Ultimate with EA Play included, and you're ready to play. Dive into hundreds of premium titles from EA Sports College Football 25 to Call of Duty Black Ops 6 and Avowed as easily as you stream your favorite shows. It's gaming made simple, and it's all on your Fire TV. With Wi-Fi 6.6E and auto low latency mode advanced technology, Fire TV Stick 4K delivers smoother, more responsive gameplay with lightning-fast speeds you need to stay competitive. With 4K streaming, watch more than 1.5 million movies and TV episodes from your favorite subscribed services like Netflix, Prime Video, Disney+, Max, and more. Head to Amazon.com/FireTV-LockedOn to get started. Xbox Game Pass Ultimate subscription and compatible controller required. Available on select devices using Fire TV Stick 4K 2nd generation, Fire TV Stick 4K Max 1st and 2nd generation, and Fire TV Cube 3rd generation. Thank you so much for making Locked On Jets your first listener, first watch every day. Big shout out to you everydayers. This is a daily podcast covering the New York Jets with new episodes each day through the week, Monday through Friday. Today, our focus is on Tet McMillan, a wide receiver out of Arizona, who very well could be the Jets pick with the 7th overall selection in the upcoming NFL draft. We've talked about what he brings to the table, the skills that I think he will bring day one. Now we're going to focus on the things that I think need improvement. Now, this is different from saying these are his weaknesses. These are areas where I think he's got to work to up his game if he wants to be a more complete player. And one of the things I always try and do is keep an open mind with these prospects, because many times you see a guy come into the league and he turns areas that were weaknesses into strengths. So none of this is to say that Tet McMillan's incapable of improving in these areas, but I think these are areas where improvement is needed. Now, I'm going to be a little controversial with this, and I think some people will view some of these points that I'm going to make as a bit of a hot take, but I'll tell you, I don't think he's a great contested catch guy at this point. I think he flashes moments. There are moments where he makes really good catches when he's got a man on him, but I don't think he's consistent at that. And I think that he's got to work on being more consistent at high pointing the ball. When you're 6'5", you have a big advantage in jump ball situations. And I think there are many instances where he doesn't do a great job timing his jump or, out leaping the defender who's on him. And this is a real area of opportunity. Again, this is going to I know I'm going to hear from people who are going to disagree with me vehemently about this. And I know that there are instances where he's done it, but I think that there are catches that were left on the field. And I will say this, again, for a guy who's 6'5", it is a learnable skill set. And if he can do that, I think big things can happen for him. Another area where I think he needs a little bit of work, and this goes hand in hand with something I mentioned in the first segment. I mentioned he's good at coming back to the ball. He's good at looking back or coming back to the ball. So I think he's good on the deep comebacks. I think he's going to be effective on the back shoulder throws. That's when he's looking back. I think getting over the top of the defense is a little bit of a struggle for him. Now, one of the things I've talked about on the show over the last couple of months is I've tried to figure out, Tet McMillan, what his strengths and weaknesses are. My biggest question with him was speed. And, he didn't run at the combine. He didn't do the 40 at the combine. So we didn't really get an answer there. But I've watched him with the ball in his hands. I've seen him find that extra gear. And, the bigger guys, they tend to not be blazers, at least early in the route, because they have longer legs, it takes longer to build up. But once you build up, once they do build up, there's a lot of speed there. So I don't see him run past a lot of defenders. I think his speed is decent though, because again, I've seen him outrun defensive backs once the ball is in his hands. So I think this might be more about the tempo of his routes, so to speak. And here's the analogy I'd use. If you're a baseball fan, some guys have 100-mile-an-hour fastball. They throw the ball really fast. Their top speed is really, really fast. Just throwing 100, though, doesn't guarantee you're going to be successful, because in the major leagues, a guy can hit 100, even a really fast fastball. A hitter can hit it because they're that good. What you got to be able to do is change speeds. So a guy who throws 93, much slower than a guy who throws 100. But if he throws a changeup that looks the exact same way as his fastball, and that only goes in the 70s, you throw hitters off. You throw hitters off because they see the same pitch, but one's much slower than the other. So Tet McMillan, he's not a 4-3 guy. That I'm pretty confident in. He doesn't need to be a 4-3 guy to be an effective deep threat. He just needs to learn how to run his routes at different tempos. Early in the route, maybe you bait the defensive back by going a little bit slow. Then you pick it up. And that's one of those things that a good wide receivers coach will be able to train him on. That's one of the things a good wide receivers coach will be able to drill in him, because the Jets do need a deep threat. And one thing in the NFL is that you don't necessarily, if you have that blazing speed, that Tyreek Hill, Jalen Waddle speed, that makes you a deep threat. But you don't necessarily need to be that type of guy to be an effective deep threat. And when you add in McMillan's ability to learn, if he can learn how to high point the deep ball and add that to tempo, then you're talking about a guy who potentially could be a complete receiver, a guy who could potentially be a matchup nightmare. That's the type of thing he'll need to learn. Another thing I would say is I think he's got to learn just how to track the ball better. This goes hand in hand with high pointing the ball while it's in the air. But I think there are moments where he's running deep routes where maybe he's not getting his head around quick enough. And his quarterback was pretty erratic in college. I mean, I watched every one of his targets to prepare for this show to give you detailed thoughts on Tet McMillan. His quarterback missed on a lot of throws, but I think there are also moments where maybe McMillan didn't look for the ball soon enough. I think another area where he's got to work is he's got to become better at tracking the football in the air. One other thing that I've noticed with him is, I mentioned that I feel like he does a good job as a route runner on the routes where he's going down the field, then coming back. The north and south routes. I think he does a good job setting up defensive backs in that way, especially when he's coming back to the ball. I don't think he's as effective at the east to west routes. Now, a guy who's 6'5" is not going to have a ton of short area quickness. And when you're going east and west, you're playing the slot, you're looking for quick breaks. That's not what a guy who's 6'5" is going to be able to do. Now, of course, in the NFL, you're seeing more and more bigger receivers play the slot just because they're able to physically out-muscle smaller slot corners. But I do think there are areas where McMillan can have more nuance and when he's breaking in or breaking out, especially when he's lined up in the slot in the middle of the field, because you can set a guy up. If you're going to break outside, you stem your route by run. You start your route by running inside, so the defender starts angling himself inside. Then you cut outside. Then it gives you an opportunity to create natural separation. I don't. Again, it's going to be a work in progress for him. It's never going to be the best part of his game, but I think that again, a good receivers coach can kind of drill this stuff into him. A good receivers coach will be able to train him on how to create more separation as a route runner. A lot of this will come down to proper technique, proper footwork, and also angling your body at the right way as you're getting off the line of scrimmage. Now, the good thing for McMillan is that at 6'5", he's not an easy guy to redirect. And that's a really important thing, because a lot of the quick throws in the NFL, a lot of the times you're getting the ball out in less than 3 seconds, you're expecting a receiver to be in a certain spot in 3 seconds. And the first 5 yards is within the line of scrimmage. The defense can hit you as hard as they want as a receiver. Once you get past 5 yards, it becomes illegal contact. But the first 5 yards, they can hit you hard. And the best way to disrupt those timing patterns where it's out in 3 seconds, receivers got to be a certain spot at a certain time, is just hit him hard and knock him off his stride, and then the pass goes incomplete. McMillan at his size is very difficult to do that. He does not move easily. If you watch him, whenever someone tries to redirect him, they fail. Even whether it's press coverage, whether it's a guy underneath trying to hit him to disrupt his route, they can't do that. So if you add some nuance with his route running, then you've got a guy who could really help. You've got a guy who could really be a dynamic and complete receiver. Now, here on the Locked On Jets podcast, we've talked about what he does now. We've talked about areas to work on that could be improved. How will Tet McMillan fit the Jets as a rookie if they draft him 7th overall? I think he slides in perfectly behind Garrett Wilson, and I'll explain why as we continue here on this Monday edition of Locked On Jets. The Armada Player of the Week is brought to you by our friends at Nissan and the all-new 2025 Nissan Armada. Each week, we're going to take a look at our draft prospects to pick one guy that stands apart, the guy we believe showcased the strength and power needed to push the Jets forward as we look ahead to the next season. And no surprise, this week's Armada and clear-cut Player of the Week is Tet McMillan. And why? Well, we already talked about it. I mean, he's a guy with a lot of potential, a guy who can catches with his hands, a guy who's dangerous after the catch, a guy who's good at those north and south routes, and a guy who has the tools, if he improves the areas where he's good at, where he's not good at, who can become a complete receiver in the league. He's rugged, and he conquers the field with capability and confidence. And when it comes to the Nissan Armada, they say go forth and conquer. And that's exactly what I think Tet McMillan can do here in New York. It's clear that our player of the week is out here ready to conquer the road ahead with confidence, just like you can conquer in the all-new Nissan Armada or any of their outstanding vehicles. Take the Nissan Armada, Rogue, or Pathfinder and go find your next big adventure. Shop NissanUSA.com. This is the Locked On Jets podcast here on this Monday. We're talking about Tet McMillan, a wide receiver prospect out of Arizona, a guy who could potentially be on the table for the New York Jets with the 7th overall pick in the 2025 NFL draft. We've talked about the areas where I think he's strong right now, the areas where he's ready to contribute, and some of the areas where I think his game needs some work, including I had some pretty controversial takes on them, and I know a lot of people are going to disagree with my take on his ability as a contested catch guy. And look, I think he could be a great receiver as a contested catch guy in the NFL. I just don't think he's there yet. I think there's certain aspects of his game that need to be worked on. But let's talk about where he would fit the New York Jets if he was drafted at 7th overall. And I think in many ways, the Jets would be a great situation for him because whenever you draft a guy 7th overall, you're expecting him to step in right away and be a big impact player. Now, I think it's clear that if the Jets draft Tet McMillan, you can pencil him in. You could probably write him in ink as a starting wide receiver because there is not a lot behind Garrett Wilson right now. And that's an understatement. I mean, if you took Garrett Wilson off this Jets receiver group, that might be the weakest wide receiver room in the league. So thank goodness we have Garrett Wilson. But having Garrett Wilson is a real benefit to the Jets, and it would be a real benefit to Tet McMillan because most receivers who go this high are going to step in and be in a situation where they're expected to be their number one receiver right off the bat. There are going to be instant expectations for them to be a 1,000-yard guy, for them to change the offense. And for Tet McMillan, when it comes to the Jets, he's not going to be the go-to guy. He's going to get opportunities, but Garrett Wilson's going to be the guy that, first of all, gets the bulk of the targets and gets the bulk of the defense's attention. That means you'll see a lot of number 2 corners. It means that you're not going to see a lot of double coverage because if there's double coverage, Garrett's probably going to get it. So it's a really fortuitous situation, or at least it would be a really fortuitous situation for McMillan if the Jets were to draft him, because this is a situation where you get to play. You know, it's not like you're a receiver room that's so loaded that you're not going to get on the field as a rookie. You'll be one of the primary receiving options in the offense, but you're not going to have the weight of the world on your shoulders. You're not going to be expected to be the go-to guy. And for a guy like McMillan, who I think has some good tools and some tools that will translate to year one production. You know, this is not a guy who's a total project. This is not a guy like, I wish I had a more recent example. A guy like Stephen Hill. Remember when the Jets drafted him in 2012 and it was just like, he was really tall and ran really fast at the combine, but had no idea how to play the wide receiver position. You're not in that situation. There's a guy who brings certain attributes to the table. His ability as a runner after the catch, you know, his ability to run the comeback routes, his ability, you know, his hands catching. These are attributes that will mean that he'll be a player year one. He'll be able to contribute in some capacity, but there are some holes to his game, holes that could potentially slow him down a little bit, if nothing else. So some holes that could potentially keep him from being a number one receiver on year one. And you know, if you look through the NFL, through the recent history of the NFL draft, you know, I think every receiver who's drafted in the first round, their team has this expectation over he's going to be a 1,000-yard guy year one. Every team does that. Every fan base does that. And typically, you know, there's about, you know, some years there's more, but typically there's about one receiver in every class who goes for 1,000 yards. And it's not always the guy who's the highest choice. You know, sometimes it's the second guy off the board. Sometimes it's the third guy off the board. It's not always the guy who comes first off the board. Now, sometimes the guy who comes first off the board is really good. He ends up being a really good player. He ends up being a 1,000-yard receiver down the road. But you don't always get the immediate impact. Sometimes you draft a guy in the first round and he's a solid guy. You know, he's maybe a 700-yard guy as a rookie. If you need a 1,000-yard guy, though, that's a problem. The Jets actually would be perfect if they drafted him and got like a 700-yard season. Now, look, of course, the Jets would take a 1,000-yard season. Jets would love it if they drafted Tet McMillan and he came in and played at Garrett Wilson's level and you had 2 legitimate number 1 receivers right off the bat. But you're not in a situation where that's the type of thing you'd need. It would be a luxury. So, in many ways, I think McMillan is a very logical choice for the Jets. I think he fits a lot of what the Jets could use. Now, the one area where I think he needs some work is, again, on those deep balls. And I think that's an area where the Jets don't really have a lot of home run threats on this offense. And as good as Garrett Wilson is, he's not really a home run type of guy. He's more of a move the chains type of guy. He's more of a a precise route running type of guy, more of a guy who can create separation, but not a home run hitter. I think that as a rookie, unless he shows rapid improvement, which is always possible, McMillan may not be that type of receiver, but he could step right in. He could probably contribute what the Jets needed. Could he contribute more? Possibly, if depending on how quickly he improves the areas where he struggles. But I think there's a high probability that the Jets drafted him, he'd be a good number 2 receiver right off the bat, and that would be no small thing for the New York Jets. And it actually everybody would slide in perfectly then, because Garrett Wilson's a legitimate number 1 receiver. What they're really lacking is that number 2 receiver. That guy who could be the second read if Garrett Wilson's double teamed or covered. Or the guy who could give Garrett Wilson a little breather, because you're not going to want, Garrett Wilson's going to be the number 1 option on most of the plays, but you got to give him a breather every now and then. So a guy who could step in and occasionally be that number 1 option, the guy with enough tools to be that number 1 option, that could be Tet McMillan. And then after that, your third, fourth, fifth receivers, that's not as big of a deal. I mean, I'm not a huge Lazard guy. Can Lazard be a number 3 receiver? Well, you'd hope. I mean, I don't know. I don't know how confident I've been on him based on the last couple of years, but you'd hope. And then, maybe Xavier Gibson, Malachi Corley, Tyler Johnson, Josh Reynolds, maybe one of those guys could show you something deeper on the depth chart. So anyway, that's the case for Tet McMillan. Of course, if the Jets just needed a receiver, it'd be the obvious choice. But because the Jets need so much, they can't have tunnel vision and only focus on the receiver position. If he was available, though, he would be a very logical choice. Anyway, that's all for today's episode. This has been the Locked On Jets podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network. Your team every day is our motto. As always, if you enjoy the show, hit the subscribe button where you're watching or listening so that you'll never miss an episode. If you enjoy the show and are listening on a podcast, give it a 5-star review. And if you're watching on YouTube and enjoy the show, give this episode a big thumbs up. Helps us out, helps other Jets fans find the podcast. Enjoy your Monday, everybody. We'll be back tomorrow to talk more Jets.